The promise had been made before Sophie Zimmerman even understood what it meant to belong to someone. And now, at 22 years old, she stood behind the counter of her father's general store in Parowan, Utah, watching the dust settle from another wagon passing through, knowing that in 3 weeks she would marry Clayton Merrick, whether her heart agreed or not. It was July of 1876, and the summer heat pressed down on the small town like a wool blanket nobody could shake off. Sophie wiped her brow with the back of her hand, careful not to smudge the ledger she had been updating for the past hour. Her father, Gerald Zimmerman, had built this store from nothing 20 years ago when Parowan was barely more than a stopover for travelers heading to California or settlers brave enough to try farming in the Utah Territory. Now it stood as one of the most successful establishments in town, and Gerald had made sure everyone knew it. The bell above the door chimed, and Sophie looked up from her work. A stranger walked in, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. Dust covered his clothes and boots, marking him as someone who had been riding hard. "Good afternoon," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the way her heart had inexplicably quickened. "Can I help you find something?" The stranger's eyes met hers, and for a moment he seemed to forget why he had come in. Then he cleared his throat and approached the counter. "I need supplies. Riding north toward Salt Lake City, and my provisions ran low faster than I expected." "Of course." Sophie pulled out a fresh piece of paper. "What exactly do you need?" As he listed items, Sophie wrote them down, stealing glances at him between words. There was something different about this man, something that set him apart from the usual cowboys and drifters who passed through Parowan. He spoke with careful consideration, his voice low and smooth, and when their hands accidentally brushed as she handed him a bag of coffee beans, she felt a jolt run through her entire body. "I am Xander Harrison," he said suddenly, as though he had been weighing whether to introduce himself. "I have been working cattle ranches down south, but I am heading up to find better opportunities." "Sophie Zimmerman," she replied, tucking a strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear. "My father owns this store." Xander glanced around the well-stocked shelves with what looked like genuine appreciation. "He has built something impressive here." Before Sophie could respond, her father emerged from the back room, his round face flushed from moving heavy crates. Gerald Zimmerman was a practical man who measured life in profits and losses, and he had long ago decided that his daughter was an investment that would yield the greatest return through marriage to Clayton Merrick, whose family owned the largest ranch in the area. "Sophie, stop chattering and finish those accounts," Gerald said brusquely, though not unkindly. His eyes swept over Xander with the assessing gaze of a merchant. "You need help, stranger." "Your daughter has been very helpful," Xander said evenly. "I am just gathering supplies for my journey." Gerald grunted and moved to help another customer who had just entered. Sophie quickly totaled Xander's purchases, her fingers working the numbers automatically while her mind raced with thoughts she should not be having. She was promised to another. Her future was already decided. This stranger would ride out of Parowan and she would never see him again, and that was exactly how it should be. "That will be $4.30, she said quietly. Xander counted out the money and placed it on the counter. As she gathered his supplies into a canvas bag, he leaned forward slightly. "This might be forward of me, but you seem troubled. Is everything all right?" The concern in his voice was so genuine that Sophie felt her carefully constructed composure crack just a little. "Everything is fine," she lied. "Just the usual worries of running a store." He did not look convinced, but he did not press further. "Thank you for your help, Miss Zimmerman. I hope your worries ease soon." After he left, Sophie stood at the counter for a long moment, staring at the door through which he had disappeared. She told herself it was foolish to feel this hollow ache in her chest over a man she had spoken to for all of 10 minutes, but her heart refused to listen to reason. That evening, as Sophie helped her mother prepare dinner in the small house attached to the store, she learned that Xander Harrison had not left town after all. He had taken a room at the boarding house and been seen talking to some of the local ranchers about work. "Probably another drifter who will cause trouble," her mother, Martha, said as she stirred a pot of stew. "Your father says we have too many of those types passing through lately." Sophie said nothing, focusing on slicing bread with more attention than the task required. She tried not to think about whether she might see Xander again, tried not to acknowledge the small flame of hope that had kindled in her chest. The next morning, Sophie was arranging bolts of fabric when Clayton Merrick walked into the store. He was a handsome man in a cold sort of way, with sharp features and pale blue eyes that never seemed to show much warmth. At 28, he had inherited his father's business sense and his mother's ambition, and he treated his impending marriage to Sophie with the same practicality he applied to buying livestock. "Sophie," he said by way of greeting, "I came to remind you about the social on Saturday. My mother expects us to attend together." "Of course, Clayton," Sophie replied, keeping her voice neutral. "I have not forgotten." He looked around the store with a proprietary air that made Sophie's skin prickle. "Once we are married, you will not need to work here anymore. My wife should not be standing behind a counter like common help." Sophie bit back the retort that rose to her lips. She loved working in the store, loved the interaction with customers, and the satisfaction of keeping the books balanced. But Clayton had made it clear that his wife would have different duties, centered entirely around his home and his social standing. "We can discuss that later," she said diplomatically. Clayton frowned, but before he could press the issue, the door opened again and Xander Harrison walked in. He stopped short when he saw Clayton standing close to Sophie, his expression carefully neutral. "Excuse me," Xander said. "I did not mean to interrupt." "You are not interrupting," Sophie said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Do you need something else?" Clayton turned to study Xander with undisguised suspicion. "Who is this?" "Just a customer," Sophie replied, even as Xander said, "Xander Harrison. I arrived yesterday." "Clayton Merrick." Clayton did not extend his hand. "I own the Merrick Ranch north of town. Are you looking for work?" "I might be," Xander said carefully. "I have experience with cattle and horses." "We are fully staffed," Clayton said flatly. He turned back to Sophie, dismissing Xander completely. "I will pick you up at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Wear something appropriate." After Clayton left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the store. Xander approached the counter slowly, his hat in his hands. "I apologize if I caused any awkwardness. I just realized I forgot to buy tobacco yesterday." Sophie retrieved a pouch of tobacco from the shelf behind her, grateful for something to do with her hands. "You did not cause anything. Clayton is just protective." "He is your husband?" Xander asked, though the way he said it made it clear he hoped the answer would be no. "Not yet," Sophie said quietly. "We are to be married in 3 weeks." Xander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Congratulations." "Thank you." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She handed him the tobacco, and when their fingers touched this time, neither of them pulled away immediately. "Miss Zimmerman," Xander began, then stopped. He seemed to be wrestling with something internal. "Forgive me, but you do not seem like a woman looking forward to her wedding." Sophie's eyes widened. No one had ever been so direct with her, had ever acknowledged the truth she tried so hard to hide. "I do not know what you mean." "I think you do." His voice was gentle, not accusatory. I have no right to say anything, being a stranger, but I have spent enough time around trapped animals to recognize the look in their eyes. The comparison should have offended her, but instead, it struck something deep and true. My father made an arrangement with the Merrick family years ago, she heard herself saying. It is a good match. Clayton is successful and respectable, and our marriage will secure both families' positions in this town. That is not what I asked, Xander said quietly. Do you want to marry him? Sophie looked up at him, at this stranger who somehow saw her more clearly than people who had known her for years. What I want has never been part of the equation. Before Xander could respond, Gerald emerged from the back room again, and the conversation ended. But as Xander left the store, Sophie felt something shift inside her, like a door she had not known existed had been cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Over the next several days, Sophie saw Xander around town more frequently. He had taken a job at the Miller Ranch, which was smaller than the Merrick spread but known for treating its workers fairly. She learned from casual gossip that he was a skilled horseman and hard worker, that he kept to himself mostly, but was unfailingly polite when he did interact with others. She also learned that he came into the general store far more often than seemed strictly necessary, always with some small item he needed to purchase. Each visit was brief, rarely more than a few minutes of conversation, but Sophie found herself looking forward to these encounters with an intensity that frightened her. On Wednesday afternoon, Xander came in just as Sophie was about to close up for the midday break. Her father had gone to a meeting with other business owners, leaving her alone in the store. I hope I am not too late, Xander said. I need needles and thread. Tore my shirt on a fence post this morning. Sophie retrieved the items, but instead of handing them over immediately, she found herself saying, I could mend it for you if you would like. It would only take a few minutes. Xander looked surprised, then pleased. I would not want to impose on your time. You would not be. Please, I insist. She did not examine too closely why she was so eager to prolong his visit. He disappeared briefly and returned with the torn shirt. Sophie led him to the small sitting area near the window where her mother sometimes did needlework when the store was slow. As she threaded the needle, Xander sat across from her, watching her work with quiet attention. You are skilled at that, he observed. My mother taught me when I was young. She said every woman should know how to mend and sew, regardless of her station in life. Sophie kept her eyes on the careful stitches, finding it easier to talk when she was not looking directly at him. Tell me about yourself, Xander. Where are you from originally? Kansas, he replied. I grew up on a small farm outside of Dodge City. My parents died of fever when I was 17, and I have been moving around ever since, working different ranches and trying to figure out where I belong. I am sorry about your parents, Sophie said softly. That must have been very difficult. It was. His voice held old pain, weathered but not forgotten. But it also gave me something I did not appreciate until later, freedom to choose my own path, even if I am still figuring out what that path should be. Sophie's hand stilled on the fabric. Freedom is a precious thing. The most precious thing, Xander agreed. He leaned forward slightly. Sophie, may I ask you something personal? She nodded, not trusting her voice. If you could choose any life for yourself with no obligations or promises binding you, what would you choose? The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before, had ever suggested that her own desires mattered. She thought about lying, about giving him some safe and acceptable answer, but something in his eyes made her want to tell the truth. I would want to travel, she said slowly, the words coming from some deep, hidden place. I have spent my entire life in Parowan. I have read books about other places, seen pictures of cities and oceans and mountains, but I have never been anywhere. I would want to see the world, or at least more of it. I would want to meet different people and learn different things. And I would want to choose who I marry, if I marry at all. I would want to fall in love naturally, not have it arranged like a business transaction. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more animated. She had never articulated these desires before, had barely let herself think them, and now they poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Xander listened intently, and when she finished, he said, "Those are not unreasonable things to want. They are the things every person should have the right to choose. But they are not things I can have," Sophie said, her brief moment of hope deflating. "I have responsibilities. My father has given me everything, and I owe him my obedience." The agreement with Clayton was made in good faith, and breaking it would shame both families. This is just how things are. "Things are only how we let them be," Xander said quietly. "Sophie, you do not know me well, and maybe I have no business saying any of this, but I cannot stand by and watch someone cage themselves when they were meant to fly." Sophie finished the last stitch and bit off the thread, handing him the mended shirt with trembling hands. "What are you suggesting?" Xander took the shirt but did not look at it. His eyes remained fixed on her face. "I am suggesting that you have a choice. It might not feel like it, but you do. You could walk away from this engagement. You could leave Parowan and build a life somewhere else, a life that belongs to you." "I have no money of my own, no skills beyond running a store," Sophie protested, even as her heart raced at the possibility he was presenting. "Where would I go? How would I survive?" "I do not have much," Xander said, "but I have enough saved to get 2 people to California or Oregon, somewhere with real opportunities. I am a hard worker and I could find employment easily. And you are intelligent and capable. You would not be helpless." Sophie stared at him, her mind reeling. "You are asking me to run away with you. We barely know each other." "I know," Xander said, and for the first time she saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "I know this is crazy. I know I should not be saying any of this. But from the moment I walked into this store and saw you, I felt something I have never felt before. Maybe you think I am insane, and maybe I am. But I look at you and I see someone who deserves so much more than a loveless marriage and a small town that will slowly suffocate her spirit. I am offering you freedom, Sophie. No expectations, no obligations. If you came with me and decided you wanted to go your own way once we reached California, I would respect that. But at least you would have the chance to choose." Sophie stood abruptly, moving to the window where she could look out at the dusty street without meeting his eyes. Her whole body was shaking, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. What he was proposing was scandalous, reckless, and completely impossible. It would devastate her parents, destroy the store's reputation, and make her an outcast in the only community she had ever known. But it also represented everything she had secretly dreamed of during long, sleepless nights when the walls of her future seemed to close in around her. "I need time to think," she whispered. "This is too big a decision to make right now." "Of course." Xander rose and came to stand beside her, careful not to touch her. "I am staying at the boarding house. If you want to talk more or if you decide you want to take that chance, come find me. But Sophie, whatever you decide, do not marry him if your heart is not in it. You deserve to be loved the way you want to love, completely and freely." After he left, Sophie sank into the chair and put her face in her hands. She sat there for a long time, torn between duty and desire, between the life she had always known and the life she had never dared to imagine. That evening, Clayton came to dinner at the Zimmerman house. He talked with Gerald about business and politics, while Sophie and her mother served the meal, and later he discussed the wedding preparations with cool efficiency. He did not ask Sophie for her opinions or preferences. He did not look at her with anything resembling love or even genuine affection. She was a piece in his plan, carefully positioned to strengthen his social standing and eventually provide him with heirs to his ranch. As she lay in bed that night, Sophie thought about Xander's words. She thought about freedom and choice, about the vast world beyond Parowan's dusty streets. She thought about what it might feel like to wake up each morning excited about the day ahead, instead of dreading it. She thought about the way her heart had lifted when Xander looked at her, really looked at her, as though she mattered as a person and not just as a tool to advance someone else's agenda. By dawn, she had made her decision. The next day was Thursday, and Sophie told her mother she was going to visit her friend Emma, who lived on the other side of town. Instead, she walked to the boarding house, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Xander was sitting on the front porch, mending a bridle. When he saw her approaching, he stood quickly, his expression hopeful and fearful in equal measure. "Can we talk?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He led her around the back of the building where they would have more privacy. The morning sun was already hot, and Sophie could feel sweat trickling down her spine, though she was not sure if it was from the heat or her nerves. "I have been thinking about what you said," she began, gripping her hands together to stop them from shaking. "And you are right. I cannot marry Clayton. I have been telling myself for months that I could go through with it, that I could learn to be content with that life, but I cannot. I will not. It would be a betrayal of everything I am." Xander's face lit up with relief and joy. "That is the first step." "What do you want to do?" "I am terrified," Sophie admitted. "But I want to leave. I want to see what else is out there, who else I could be if I was not Sophie Zimmerman, the general store owner's obedient daughter. I want to choose my own future." "And do you want to leave with me?" Xander asked carefully. "Because that part is important. I meant what I said about no expectations, but I need to know if you want me to come with you or if you would rather go on your own." Sophie looked at him, at this man who had walked into her life and offered her the most precious gift anyone had ever given her. "I barely know you," she said honestly. "We have spoken only a handful of times. But I feel something when I am with you, something I have never felt with Clayton or anyone else. I cannot promise you love right now because that would not be fair to either of us, but I can promise you that I want to find out what this feeling might become. I want to get to know you. I want the chance to see if what I feel might grow into something real and lasting." Xander stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "That is all I could ask for. A chance is enough." They spent the next hour planning in hushed, urgent tones. They would leave on Saturday morning very early, before most of the town was awake. Xander would secure horses and supplies without drawing attention. Sophie would pack a small bag with her essentials and whatever money she had saved from helping in the store. They would head west toward Cedar City first, then south through the Utah Territory into Arizona before turning west toward California. It was a long journey, but it would take them far from Parowan and the scandal that would inevitably follow. "Your father will come after us," Xander warned. "And Clayton will be furious. We might face real danger." "I know," Sophie said, though the thought made her stomach clench with fear. "But I would rather face danger than spend the rest of my life in a prison of my own making." That evening, Sophie wrote 2 letters. The first was to her parents, trying to explain her decision in a way that would minimize their pain while still honoring her truth. The second was to Clayton, releasing him from their engagement and apologizing for the embarrassment this would cause his family. She did not apologize for choosing herself, because she was not sorry for that. Friday passed in a blur of nervous energy and careful normalcy. Sophie went about her usual duties in the store, helping customers and updating the books, all while her mind raced with thoughts of the next morning. Every time the door opened, she expected to see Clayton or her father with suspicion in their eyes, but no one seemed to notice anything amiss. Xander came in once briefly to buy jerky for the trail. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he gave her the smallest nod of reassurance before leaving. That tiny gesture steadied her more than any words could have. That night, Sophie barely slept. She listened to her parents' soft breathing in the next room and felt a wave of guilt wash over her. They had given her a good life by their standards. They had fed and clothed and educated her. They loved her in their way, even if that love came with chains attached. She would hurt them deeply by leaving, and that knowledge sat heavy in her chest. But she also knew that staying would slowly kill something essential inside her, and in the end that would hurt them too, just in a different way. At 4 in the morning, Sophie rose and dressed quietly in her most practical traveling clothes. She retrieved the small bag she had hidden under her bed, containing 2 changes of clothes, her saved money, her mother's old Bible, and the only photograph she owned of her family. She placed the letters on her pillow where they would be found, and then she slipped out of the house like a ghost. Xander was waiting at the edge of town with 2 horses, both saddled and packed with supplies. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten from black to deep blue, and the air held the cool promise of dawn. "Are you ready?" he asked softly as Sophie approached. She looked back at Parowan one last time, at the dark shapes of buildings she had known her entire life, at the store where she had spent countless hours, at the home where she had grown from child to woman. Then she looked at Xander, at his steady gaze and the future he represented, uncertain but full of possibility. "I am ready," she said, and meant it. He helped her mount her horse, and together they rode out of Parowan as the sun began to rise, painting the Utah desert in shades of gold and pink. Sophie did not look back again. They rode hard for the first few hours, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the town before the letters were discovered. The landscape around them was rugged and beautiful, all red rock and scrubby vegetation under an endless blue sky. Sophie had rarely been outside Parowan, and the vastness of the world around her was both exhilarating and terrifying. By mid-morning, Xander suggested they rest the horses and eat something. They stopped near a small spring, letting the animals drink while they shared dried beef and hard biscuits from Xander's supplies. "How are you feeling?" he asked as they sat in the shade of a scraggly juniper tree. "Like I might be sick," Sophie admitted, "but also like I might fly." "Is that strange?" "Not strange at all." Xander handed her a canteen. "You are brave, Sophie. What you did takes more courage than most people ever find." "I do not feel brave. I feel like a coward running away instead of facing things." "There is a difference between running away and refusing to be trapped," Xander said firmly. "You are not a coward. You are someone fighting for her own life, and there is nothing shameful about that." They continued riding throughout the day, stopping only to rest the horses and stretch their legs. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they made camp in a small canyon that offered some protection from the wind. Xander built a fire while Sophie unpacked what they would need for the night. There was an awkwardness between them now that the adrenaline of the escape had faded, a reminder that they were essentially strangers who had committed to this journey together based on feelings they barely understood. "We should talk about expectations," Xander said as they ate a simple meal of beans and coffee. "I want you to feel safe with me, Sophie. I promise I will never do anything you are not comfortable with. We can travel as companions, nothing more, until or unless you decide you want something different." Sophie appreciated his directness, even as it made her blush. "Thank you for saying that. I trust you, Xander. I would not have come with you if I did not. But you are right that we need to get to know each other better before anything else." "Then let us do that," he said with a smile. "Tell me something about yourself that I do not know, something real." They stayed up late that night, talking by the fire. Sophie told him about her childhood dreams of becoming a teacher, about her love of reading, and how she had devoured every book she could get her hands on in Parowan's small library. She told him about her mother's sadness over not having more children, and how that had made Sophie feel like she had to be perfect to compensate for being an only child. Xander shared stories of his own childhood, of helping his father with the farm and learning to break horses from a neighbor. He talked about his parents with a love tempered by loss, and about the loneliness of drifting from place to place without roots or real connections. "Why did you stay in Parowan?" Sophie asked. "You said you were just passing through, but you took a job and rented a room. What made you stay?" Xander poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. "Honestly, you. After that first conversation in the store, I could not get you out of my head. I told myself I was being foolish, that I should just move on, but I could not leave. I had to see you again, even if I had no good reason to hope anything could come of it." His honesty made Sophie's heart ache in the most wonderful way. "I thought about you too," she confessed. "More than I should have, given that I was engaged to another man. You made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in years, maybe ever." They fell asleep on opposite sides of the fire that night, but Sophie felt more connected to Xander than she ever had to Clayton, despite years of knowing him. The next several days fell into a rhythm. They rode during the cooler hours of morning and evening, resting during the hottest part of the day. They talked constantly, learning each other's stories and discovering shared interests and values. Xander proved to be patient and thoughtful, always asking Sophie's opinion and respecting her answers. He taught her how to better handle her horse and how to read the land for signs of water. In turn, she helped him improve his reading by sharing passages from her mother's Bible during their evening camps. By the time they reached Cedar City, 5 days after leaving Parowan, Sophie felt like she had known Xander for years rather than weeks. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable familiarity that made her smile when she woke to find him already making coffee, or when their hands brushed as they worked together to set up camp. They decided to spend a night in Cedar City to resupply and let the horses rest properly. Xander found them rooms at a small hotel, carefully booking 2 separate spaces and making it clear to the proprietor that they were traveling companions. Nothing inappropriate. After settling in, Sophie took the opportunity to wash properly and change into her clean dress. When she came downstairs to meet Xander for dinner, his expression when he saw her made her pulse quicken. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." Sophie felt suddenly shy. It feels good to be clean again. Over dinner at a small restaurant, they discussed their plans. "We should head through Arizona territory," Xander suggested. "It will be hot, but the route is more direct and there are established trails. From there, we can cut through the Mojave and into California. I am thinking we might try San Diego. I have heard there are opportunities there, and it is far enough from Utah that we should be safe." "How long will the journey take?" Sophie asked. "A few more weeks if all goes well. Longer if we run into trouble." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you having second thoughts?" Sophie looked down at their joined hands, at how natural it felt to have his fingers wrapped around hers. "No second thoughts about leaving. But I am nervous about what comes next. We have been so focused on the journey itself, but what happens when we arrive? What will our lives look like?" "Whatever we want them to look like," Xander said. That is the beauty of starting fresh. We get to decide. That night, as Sophie lay in her bed at the hotel, she realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling in love with Xander Harrison. It was not the grand, dramatic passion she had read about in novels, but something steadier and deeper. It was in the way he made her coffee just how she liked it without being asked, and how he listened when she talked about her fears and dreams. It was in his quiet strength and his unwavering support of her choices. It was in the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and worth protecting. She was not ready to tell him yet, but she knew with bone-deep certainty that this was what love was supposed to feel like. They left Cedar City the next morning and turned south into Arizona territory. The landscape changed dramatically as they traveled, becoming more arid and harsh. The summer heat was relentless, and they had to be strategic about when they traveled and how much water they carried. 8 days out from Cedar City, they stopped at a small trading post near the Arizona-Utah border to refill their water supplies. The man who ran the post, a grizzled old-timer named Jeremiah, eyed them with open curiosity. "You two married?" he asked bluntly as Xander paid for supplies. "Not yet," Xander said carefully. "We are traveling together to California," Jeremiah grunted. "Might want to say you are married if anyone asks. Folks get funny about a man and woman traveling alone together if they are not kin or wed." After they left, Sophie and Xander discussed the old man's advice. "He is probably right," Sophie said reluctantly. "I hate to lie, but we do not want to draw the wrong kind of attention." "We could get married for real," Xander said suddenly. They had stopped to rest the horses, and he turned to face her fully. "I am not saying this because of what anyone else thinks. I am saying it because I love you, Sophie Zimmerman. I think I have loved you since that first day in the general store when you looked at me like you actually saw me as a person and not just another drifter. I know it has only been a couple of weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to spend the rest of my days with you, if you will have me." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known her feelings for him were growing, but hearing him declare his love so openly and honestly made her heart feel like it might burst. "Are you proposing to me in the middle of the desert? I suppose I am." Xander smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "I do not have a ring, and this is not very romantic, but yes. Sophie, will you marry me?" She thought about how different this proposal was from her engagement to Clayton. There had been no proposal there, just an announcement that an agreement had been reached. This, in contrast, was a choice freely offered and freely accepted. "Yes," she said, and then laughed at how simple it was. "Yes, Xander, I will marry you. I love you too. I was not planning to say it yet, but I do. I love the way you see the world and the way you treat me like an equal. I love your kindness and your strength. I want to build a life with you." Xander pulled her into his arms and kissed her then, their first real kiss, under the blazing Arizona sun with nothing but desert and sky as witnesses. It was everything a kiss should be, tender and passionate and full of promise. They found a small town 2 days later with a circuit preacher making his monthly rounds. The man agreed to marry them in a simple ceremony with the local school teacher and her husband as witnesses. Sophie wore her clean dress with some wildflowers Xander had picked woven into her hair, and Xander wore his least dusty shirt. It was not the elaborate wedding that had been planned in Parowan, but it was infinitely better because it was real and chosen and rooted in actual love. That night, at a small hotel in town, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and care. Xander was patient and attentive, making sure Sophie felt safe and cared for. It was Sophie's first time, and though there was some pain and awkwardness, There was also joy and connection, and a sense of rightness that made her certain she had made the right choice in every way. They continued their journey as husband and wife, and the difference in how they were treated was immediately noticeable. People were friendlier, more helpful. There were no suspicious looks or uncomfortable questions. They were just another young couple heading west to seek their fortune, and that made them unremarkable in the best possible way. The journey through Arizona territory was grueling. The heat was intense, and water was scarce in places. They had one terrifying encounter with a rattlesnake that nearly struck Xander, and another with a group of rough-looking men who seemed to be considering robbing them, until Xander made it clear he was armed and willing to defend them both. But there were beautiful moments, too. They saw sunsets that painted the entire sky in colors Sophie could never have imagined. They met helpful strangers who shared food and advice. They learned to work together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs and supporting each other through difficulties. 6 weeks after leaving Parowan, they crossed into California. The landscape began to change again, becoming somewhat less harsh as they moved west. They were tired, dusty, and nearly out of money, but they had made it. They reached San Diego on a warm September afternoon. The city was larger than anywhere Sophie had ever been, bustling with activity and possibility. The sight of the ocean took her breath away. She had read about it, of course, but reading could not compare to the reality of that vast expanse of blue stretching to the horizon. "What do you think?" Xander asked, watching her face. "I think it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Sophie said honestly. "And I think we are going to build a good life here." Finding work and establishing themselves was not easy. Xander took whatever jobs he could find at first, working at the docks and in stables. Sophie found employment at a boarding house, helping with cooking and cleaning. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but they were together and they were free, and that made every struggle worthwhile. They rented a tiny room in a working-class neighborhood and made it their own. Sophie hung curtains she sewed herself, and Xander built them a bookshelf from scrap wood. It was not much, but it was theirs, earned through their own efforts and filled with their own choices. Over the next year, their situation gradually improved. Xander's skills with horses became known, and he was hired by a wealthy man who needed someone to manage his stables. The pay was better, and it came with a small cottage on the property. Sophie, meanwhile, discovered she had a talent for business. She helped the boarding house owner reorganize their operations, making everything more efficient and profitable. The owner was so impressed that she made Sophie her manager and gave her a share in the profits. They moved into the cottage and began to truly build a home. Sophie planted a garden, and Xander built furniture in his spare time. They made friends in their neighborhood and attended church on Sundays. They were known as the Harrisons, the friendly young couple from Utah who worked hard and treated everyone with respect. 2 years after arriving in San Diego, Sophie discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They were still young and establishing themselves, and a baby would change everything. But it also felt like the perfect next step in the life they were creating together. "We are going to be parents," Xander said, his hand resting gently on Sophie's still flat stomach. "That is amazing and terrifying." "I know," Sophie agreed, "but we have faced bigger challenges than this. We will figure it out together like we always do." Their son was born in the spring of 1879, a healthy baby with Xander's dark hair and Sophie's hazel eyes. They named him Thomas Gerald Harrison, the middle name in honor of Sophie's father despite everything. Sophie had written to her parents once, a year after leaving, to let them know she was safe and married. She had never received a response, and she had accepted that they might never forgive her. but she could honor the good parts of her childhood while still standing by her decision to choose her own path. Thomas was a happy baby who grew into an adventurous toddler. Sophie reduced her hours at the boarding house to care for him, and Xander's employer was understanding about his need to be home more. They navigated the challenges of parenthood with the same teamwork they brought to everything, supporting each other through sleepless nights and teething troubles, and all the small crises that come with raising a child. When Thomas was 3, they had enough money saved to make a down payment on a small property of their own. It was not fancy, just a simple house with some land on the outskirts of San Diego, but it was theirs completely. Xander started raising horses seriously, building a reputation for producing well-trained, reliable animals. Sophie opened a small general store in town, using everything she had learned from her father to make it successful. The store's success was particularly meaningful to Sophie. She had taken the knowledge her father gave her and used it to build something of her own. She ran her store differently than he had run his, treating her employees well and encouraging them to have opinions and ideas. She became known as a fair and honest businesswoman, someone who stood behind her products and treated every customer with respect. 5 years after Thomas was born, Sophie gave birth again, this time to twin daughters they named Sarah and Emma. The girls had their mother's honey-colored hair and their father's storm-gray eyes, and they brought chaos and laughter into the Harrison household in equal measure. Life was full and busy, but it was good. Xander's horse business thrived, and Sophie's store expanded. They were well respected in their community, and genuinely happy in a way that neither had been sure was possible during those first fearful days of their escape from Parowan. One evening, when Thomas was 10 and the twins were 5, the family was gathered around the dinner table when Thomas asked a question that made both parents pause. "Mama, why do not we ever see your parents? Do they not want to visit us?" Sophie and Xander exchanged glances. They had known this conversation would come eventually, but it still caught Sophie off guard. She took a breath and chose her words carefully. "When your father and I got married, my parents did not approve of our choice," she said honestly. "They had planned for me to marry someone else, someone they thought was better suited to me. When I chose your father instead, it hurt them very much, and they decided they could not forgive me for it." "That seems unfair," Thomas said with the clear-eyed judgment of a child. "You and Papa are perfect together. Anyone can see that." Xander reached over and ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "Thank you for saying that, son. But sometimes people cannot see what is right in front of them because they are too focused on their own plans and expectations. Your mother's parents loved her, but they also wanted to control her life. When she refused to be controlled, they chose their pride over their relationship with her." "I do not understand that," Sarah piped up. "If I had a daughter, I would want her to be happy more than anything." "That is because you are a wise little girl," Sophie said, pulling her daughter close. "And that is exactly how your father and I feel about all of you. We want you to be happy and make your own choices, even if those choices are different from what we might prefer." Later that night, after the children were in bed, Sophie and Xander sat on their porch watching the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked quietly. "Leaving your family, your home, everything you knew." Sophie leaned against him, secure in the warmth of his presence. "Never, not once. I regret that it had to hurt people I loved, and I wish my parents could have found it in their hearts to accept my choice. But I do not regret the choice itself. Look at what we have built, Xander. Look at our children and our home and our businesses. Look at the life we have created together, based on love and mutual respect and freedom to be ourselves. How could I regret any of that? I just want to make sure you are happy," he said, kissing the top of her head. You gave up so much to take a chance on a wandering cowboy with nothing but a horse and some half-formed dreams. I gave up a life that was not mine in exchange for one that is, Sophie corrected. And you were not just a wandering cowboy. You were the man brave enough to offer me freedom when everyone else wanted to keep me caged. You saw me, really saw me, when no one else bothered to look. That is worth more than any amount of security or status. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and enjoying each other's company. After 15 years of marriage, they had long since settled into a deep, abiding love that did not require constant words to sustain it. The years continued to pass in a blur of activity and growth. Thomas grew into a responsible young man who helped his father with the horses and showed a real talent for training them. The twins developed distinct personalities despite being identical in appearance. Sarah was thoughtful and loved reading, while Emma was adventurous and always getting into minor mischief. When Thomas turned 18, he surprised his parents by announcing he wanted to go to San Francisco to study veterinary medicine. It would mean leaving the family business and moving away, and it would be expensive, but Xander and Sophie supported his dream completely. "This is what we always wanted for our children," Sophie said as they helped Thomas prepare for his departure. "The freedom to choose their own paths. We cannot hold him back just because we will miss him." "You are right," Xander agreed, "but I am still allowed to be sad about it." Sophie hugged him. "Of course you are. I am sad too, but we are also proud, and that is more important." Thomas returned after his studies, bringing with him new knowledge and techniques that he used to expand the family horse business. He also brought a wife, a lovely young woman named Catherine, who he had met in San Francisco. The wedding was a joyous occasion, celebrated with friends and neighbors who had become like family over the years. As Sophie watched her son dance with his new bride, she thought about her own wedding day in that small Arizona town. She thought about how far they had come from that frightened young woman and drifting cowboy who took a chance on each other. They had built not just a life but a legacy, one rooted in love and freedom and the courage to choose one's own path. The twins grew up and made their own choices. Sarah became a teacher, fulfilling the dream her mother had once held for herself. Emma shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to help run the store, showing a head for business that rivaled Sophie's own. She eventually took over complete management, allowing Sophie to step back and enjoy a slower pace of life. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Xander and Sophie traveled back to the coast, where they had first seen the ocean together. They were older now, with gray threading through their hair and lines on their faces earned through decades of laughter and hard work. But they still held hands like newlyweds, and when Xander looked at Sophie, his eyes still held that same wonder and love they had shown 30 years earlier. "Thank you," Sophie said suddenly as they walked along the beach, "for everything, for seeing me when no one else did, for offering me freedom, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you for being brave enough to take the chance," Xander replied. "Thank you for choosing me and for choosing yourself. You have given me everything I never knew I needed." They stood together on the sand, watching the waves roll in, and Sophie reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She thought about that moment in the general store when Xander had first walked in, how something in her had recognized something in him. She thought about the terrifying decision to leave everything she knew and the incredible life that decision had made possible. She had been promised to another, but a cowboy had offered her freedom instead, and that freedom had become the foundation of a love story more beautiful than any she had read about in books. It had not always been easy, but it had been real and true and entirely their own. And that, Sophie thought as Xander pulled her close, was worth everything. They returned home to San Diego to find their children had organized a surprise party for their anniversary. The house was filled with friends and neighbors, with Thomas and Catherine and their 2 children, with Sarah and her husband, with Emma and her serious young man who everyone suspected would soon become a son-in-law. There was food and music and laughter, and as Sophie stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by the life she and Xander had created, she felt a sense of profound gratitude and joy. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Sophie and Xander sat in their bedroom, tired but content. "We did well, did we not?" Xander said, pulling Sophie into his arms. "We did," Sophie agreed. "We built something beautiful from nothing but faith in each other." "I love you, Sophie Harrison," he said. "I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for 30 more if we are lucky enough to have them." "I love you too," Sophie whispered. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give. You gave me myself." They fell asleep wrapped around each other. 2 people who had found freedom and love in equal measure, who had chosen each other every day for 3 decades, and would continue to choose each other for all their remaining days. The years that followed were quieter, gentler. Sophie and Xander became grandparents multiple times over as their children built families of their own. They passed on their businesses to the younger generation, secure in the knowledge that their life's work would continue. They traveled some, finally taking that trip to see more of the world that Sophie had always dreamed about. They went to San Francisco and Portland. They toured the mountains and the deserts. They saw things and met people and collected memories to sustain them in their final years. As they aged, their bodies slowed, but their love never dimmed. They were still affectionate, still supportive, still each other's favorite person in any room. Their children and grandchildren looked at them and saw what marriage should be, what partnership and respect and genuine love looked like when sustained over a lifetime. Sophie Zimmerman Harrison lived to be 73 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep with Xander beside her. Her funeral was attended by over 200 people, testament to the life she had built and the people she had touched. She was remembered as a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother and grandmother, and a woman of integrity who had always stood by her convictions. Xander followed her 18 months later, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of hard work and a year and a half of missing his beloved wife. Their children buried them side by side in the cemetery overlooking the ocean, with a simple stone that read, "Xander and Sophie Harrison." They chose love. They chose freedom. They chose each other. But their story did not end with their deaths. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the businesses they had built, in the values they had instilled. It lived on in the way Thomas encouraged his children to follow their dreams, and in the way Sarah taught her students that they could be anything they wanted to be. It lived on in Emma's fair treatment of her employees, and in the way all the Harrison descendants understood that love was a choice you made every day, not an obligation imposed from outside. Years later, one of Sophie's great-granddaughters, researching family history, would find the letters Sophie had left in Parowan that long-ago morning in 1876. The letters had been preserved by Sophie's mother, who had kept them hidden away, even though she never responded to her daughter's later attempt at contact. In one of the letters, Sophie had written words that the great-granddaughter would have inscribed on a plaque in the family home. "I cannot marry a man I do not love to fulfill a promise I never made. I choose to believe that real love is possible, that freedom matters more than security, and that a life lived authentically is worth any risk. I hope someday you will understand and forgive me. But even if you cannot, I must still choose myself." Those words became a touchstone for future generations of Harrisons, a reminder that courage and love could create something beautiful even from the most uncertain beginnings. The story of Sophie and Xander Harrison became family legend, told and retold with pride and reverence. It was the story of a general store owner's daughter who was promised to another, but chose differently. It was the story of a cowboy who offered freedom instead of chains. It was the story of two people who met at exactly the right moment and had the courage to build a life based on love and respect, and the fundamental belief that every person deserved the right to choose their own path. It was, in the end, a story about what was possible when you valued freedom over security and love over obligation. It was proof that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust your heart, even when every practical consideration argued against it. And it was a testament to the enduring power of a love freely given and freely received, sustained over a lifetime through partnership and commitment, and the simple, profound joy of having chosen exactly right. In Parowan, Utah, the old general store still stood, though it had changed hands many times over the years. Sometimes tourists would stop in and ask about the history of the building, and occasionally someone would tell them the story of Sophie Zimmerman, the owner's daughter who ran away with a cowboy one summer morning in 1876. The story had become local legend, embellished and romanticized over the years until it barely resembled the real events. But in San Diego, California, the Harrison family knew the truth. They knew that their ancestor had not run away on a whim or been seduced by a charming rogue. They knew she had made a carefully considered choice to claim her own life and future. They knew that Xander had not stolen her away, but had offered her a partnership based on equality and respect. And they knew that the love their ancestors had built together was as real and solid as the businesses they had created and the family they had raised. That love had started with a chance meeting in a general store and a cowboy brave enough to see a caged bird and offer it the sky. It had grown through a dangerous journey across desert territory and been cemented in a simple ceremony with wild flowers and makeshift rings. It had been tested by hardship and struggle and the normal challenges of building a life from nothing. And it had endured, strong and true, for over 50 years until death finally parted them. It was the kind of love story that deserved to be remembered and retold, not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was real and hard-won, and based on the fundamental conviction that every person deserved the freedom to choose love for themselves. And so the story of Sophie and Xander Harrison lived on, passed down through generations as both history and inspiration, a reminder that sometimes the most important promise you could make was not the one imposed on you by others, but the one you made to yourself to live authentically and love completely, regardless of the cost. In the end, that was the legacy they left behind. Not just the businesses and the property and the family name, but the example of what it meant to choose bravely and love deeply and build a life that was truly, completely their own. It was a legacy worth preserving, and the Harrison family made sure it would never be forgotten.